on the offensive. How dare these countries, how dare the media not talk about the genocidal agenda of the Arabs more broadly, of Hamas, of not just the religious movement, the Islamofascism, of the secular Islamic Arab movements. Has to be hammering away at it.
Next round, Dr. Shalom Friedman, Dr. Alvin Falk, and the gentleman here, no? Okay, please.
You partially answered my question already, and thank you very much for your talk, by the way. My question is really, considering the greatness and variety of threats to Israel, what could constitute a healthy response? What does a healthy response mean in being under siege? Obviously, the analogies between an abused child in Israel's situation, quite far indeed, but that's essentially the question. Thank you.
Avner?
Well, this is a fascinating lecture, fascinating subject, and I will try to limit myself to one comment and one question, because there's so much to say, but the time is very short. As to Martin's comments at the beginning that there had been no books on self-hate, Jewish self-hate, this is not accurate. There was a very important book by Sander Gilman. It was a very important American. Sorry?
I said there were no clear books. Gilman's book is unreadable. I've given it here to 5 interns who gave up.
Not Gilman. Gilman. Sander Gilman is considered one of the most important scholars in American Jewish scholarship today. I don't want to debate the merits of the book, but the book does exist, and I think it should be mentioned. Now, as far as the basic issue here, my question has to do not with disputing the thesis, but with methodology. How do you move from individual to collective psychology? We have known since the late 19th century, Gustave Le Bon, the psychology of crowds, since 1921, Freud, group psychology and analysis of the ego, and since the last 3 decades, the work of Amit Volkan, all of them very important, that large groups, nations, and so on have a very different psychology than that of the individual. Now, the psychology of the individual child who is abused, as you have very well explained it, has a term in psychoanalysis which is called identification with the aggressor. You haven't mentioned it, but it's obviously what you were referring to. Now, the question, of course, is how do you move from this to the psychology of the large group, the nation? Is it possible to jump from the identification with the aggressor of a child, an abused child, to that of the besieged nation? And how do you justify it methodologically? Thank you very much.
The first question was the greatness and the variety of threat in which the Israeli stance be. Well, first and foremost, you have to teach Israelis, teach children, teach adults who don't know, that Israel has a right to be here. The Jews have a right to be here. Their cause is just. That's number one. And historically, in Jewish history, in Zionist history, in the history of other nations, Israel has a stronger case, Jews have a stronger case to be here in a nation of their own than virtually, the vast majority of other states in the world. So, and you have to have people believe it. And then you say, well, what's the task then? You can look at what Israel has created. There has to be a counter voice to the cultural elite in the country who constantly diminish what you've created, constantly demean what you've created. Look what you've created. You've created under siege, basically by being able to defend yourselves and then not making defense the sole end of the country, self-defense, and building behind the defense. And if people believe that they have a right to be here, that their right greatly exceeds the attacks, the indictments of their enemies, and greatly exceeds the claims, even other claims of their enemies, have as much right as their enemies have to be in their lands. And you emphasize, then you have a spirit behind, a will to defend yourself, and you've demonstrated capacity to defend yourself, a capacity you can maintain. And you maintain that capacity with the people who know the reasons why they're here and what they're doing here, and the people who will continue to build here. That has to be the essential defense.
Thank you very much.
And on the issue of identification with, first of all, there is again, there's a social scientist, it's not just psychiatrists and laterally looking at, well, how can we generalize our perceptions when working with individuals to groups? I mean, you have the social sciences, what Thurgood Marshall was cited. It's a huge literature that talks about the psychology of groups. You know? So it's not something that I'm just extrapolating from individual that works with psychiatrists, psychologists dealing with individuals. Secondly, I talk about identification with the aggressor in the book, but it's not Anna Freud's concept, because Anna Freud's concept is a much broader one. In other words, it's a universal one. And Anna Freud's concept, it's really in the context of psychoanalysis, Anna Freud's identification with the aggressor is a very subversive concept, because it really is an alternative basic comprehension, a critique of her father's drive theory. Because if you talk about being driven by she makes it universal. She says identification with the aggressor exists universally. Every child who's criticized by parents incorporates that criticism, takes it in order to be able to ingratiate himself or herself with the parent. You know? And that's the universal example of identification with the aggressor. And in psychoanalytic terms, it's really an alternative to guilt theory. Because guilt theory and to drive theory, because drive theory, guilt's a basic concept. You have these drives that you're ashamed of, you repress them, and so forth. But here it say, no, you're not repressing your perceptions of reality for the sake of, shameful drives. You're repressing them to ingratiate yourself with parents. So it enters, it's subversive drive theory. It enters into object relations theory. It's much more integratable in that context. But anyway, I'm using it much more specific. I think it's a different phenomenon. It's not just an extrapolation when you have an abused child. It jumps to a different level. It jumps to, it's at a much more intense level of abuse in the content and trying to relieve yourself from genuine abuse that I argue takes a different dimension. And so it really is more comprehensive, comparable to the situation of the abused child rather than the general identification with the aggressor that she talks about. The issue of changing from individual to community, I don't think it's any problem here at all. Again, you have social science literature on this. Now you can say, well, what about the definition of obsession, of delusion? Because the strict definition of delusion is someone who adopts a concept that's inconsistent with his or her level of education, cultural background, social background, and so forth. So, for example, if necessary, you're talking about delusions. If you have somebody comes into your office, in my office in Boston, and talks about, he believes that he's being haunted by ghosts, and I want to say, well, this is a delusion. If he just immigrated from society in which everybody around him believes in ghosts, I have to weigh it differently. Now, so to say that people who embrace Oslo were deluding themselves, the counter would say, well, but they were part of a whole society, at least a clique in the country. Their circles in Tel Aviv, the cultural elite circles or whatever, or their political circles in the top around Balin or something. They shared it, so is it still a delusion if that's their cultural, perspective? But I think you can look at these same people and say, well, how would they weigh evidence otherwise? You get people in the military, and they look at they have backgrounds in intelligence and artillery and whatever, and the Air Force, and they have a way of weighing intelligence, weighing evidence, and they did it very effectively and very successfully. And yet they throw out all those standards in talking about weighing Arafat's intentions towards Israel and embracing Oslo. So I think you can still apply the concept of delusion.
Okay, we have two more questions at the moment. Professor Sloney, Mr. Liebler. Any more? Then Kate Helgren. And with that, we will close. 3 more questions.
I wonder if you would comment on the fact that, in a certain sense, official institutions in Israel, by adopting some of the language and terminology of the Arabs, are undermining our position constantly. Such institutions like the universities and even the Supreme Court, they're talking about kibush as if what is occupied land And of course, not only undermines our position in the West Bank, what right do we have to retain any part of the West Bank, or for instance, what right do we have to retain East Jerusalem and maintain Jerusalem as a united city? If it's all occupied, so that then we've taken it from somebody. And in this way, the process has graduated from the original recognition that we had title and claim to all of what had been mandatory Palestine, and now it's just that we're trying to defend the western part of Palestine for ourselves, instead of recognizing our original position and maintaining and sticking with it.
Easy.
I, of course, identify virtually entirely with everything you've said and is contained in your book, but there's one question I wanted to ask you to perhaps try and develop. This whole issue of identification with the aggressor, which we use more frequently in a non-psychological aspect in the terms of self-hatred. Now, you deal there with this issue and demonstrate that this is not new. It's been a constant phenomenon of Jewish history, and it's a constant phenomenon of the history of all countries. The question I think is very important for us to understand is, why has this become such an enormous rash in the last few years? Why is it playing such an important role if you identify the war against us, the war of ideas against us? It's the self-hatred elements, an expression incidentally which it's very, very nasty to use that word self-hatred. If you use that word self-hatred, even in a reputable paper, don't use bad language like that. But that issue of self-hatred, it is virtually enveloping and playing the major role in the fight against us in the war of ideas. Why so much now? Why has it extended so much in recent years?
Kate, please.
Hi. I want to know, why do some societies seem immune to the syndrome? I don't see it apparent among the Palestinians, and they certainly feel besieged. So, and I don't notice it in other Arab countries or populations that feel that they're under attack. In fact, they act the opposite.
The first question was the official institutions. Well, clearly, by definition, Oslo is a failure of institutions, is a failure of Israeli institutions. Why weren't people educated to understand their right to be here, to understand the siege against them, to understand what the Palestinians? Why weren't newspapers institutions? Why weren't they saying what the Palestinians were saying in their media, in their mosques, in their schools? You know, and you can go down a list of institutions. It was clearly a failure of institutions. When you talk about university, you're right. Israel adopts the language. Why is it called an intifada? It was a terror war launched by Arafat against Israel. Why does anybody in Israel talk about a second intifada? It's using their language. Why do we talk about occupied land? Okay. Legally, Judea and Samaria are not occupied land. In terms of 242, in terms of the United Security Council resolutions, it's disputed land. Why did anybody in Israel ever use occupied land? You can talk about the population or living in this, and obviously it's not in this political limbo, and in their situation, they're very unpleasant situation over the last several decades. But if you talk about the land itself, and again, you have in 242 was introduced that Israel should withdraw from land, not all the land. I mean, all the authors of 242 said it much more explicitly. Israel should not return to the 67 lines. Lord Carradine, who was the British representative in the Security Council at the time, who introduced 242, said it explicitly. He said it in an interview years later to the Beirut Star. We didn't insist on return because Israel should not return. It was an invitation to aggression. That's what he said. George Brown, who was foreign minister then, said that. Goldberg, who was the American representative, said it. Lyndon Johnson said it. Well, why should Israelis say no? They're all wrong. We don't have any strategic interest. We don't have any legitimate strategic interest. We can go if you go down institutional failures. We could be here for a very long time indeed. The second question. I can't read my handwriting on that.
Easy.
Why now? Why now? Well, I think, again, obviously that was a basic question I asked myself. I think that as I said, the fact that the government was taken over by a party with whom, to say it mildly, the social Zionist constituency did not identify. For 15 years they were governed by that. I think that fueled the expansion of this perspective dramatically. And so the first time they recaptured the government in '92, they then introduced delusional policies. But the background to that had been building over the previous 15 years, and I think the dynamics, as I said, of the government being in the hands of these alien others, as they were comprehended, was key to that. Now you can talk about, some people have said, well, if you talk about intelligentsia, you can talk about it in other communities too. You see, American campuses, European campuses, and that's, I could say a lot of things about that. I won't go into it now. But what's interesting in Israel was how it felt. First of all, the extremity in the academics and the media. You don't see that in America or even in Europe in that way. And also the way it filtered out, how much of the man in the street, how much of the hoi polloi embraced this too. You certainly don't see that in America, and not quite in Europe in the same way either. Let me get to the other question, the issue of Palestinians and under siege and what they, certainly they perceive themselves under siege in a sense, and they have been living as a disenfranchised, essentially, in political limbo for these decades. But first of all, you can say generally that a people who have cultural, ethnic ties, and with whom identify with other populations that have nations of their own, that are dominant populations, view these things differently in general. That is, so if you look at ethnic Chinese populations when they were being abused in Indonesia or in Vietnam, the fact that there's this dominant China up there, they take solace from that. It helps maintain community integrity, even when China is not supportive of them. And you talk about Indian populations in East Africa and the same. So the dynamic's different. Just the fact that Israel's surrounded by all these dominant, Arab power, these Arab independent states and powerful states, and their oil wealth, and they jerk the West around to some degree. People take some comfort in that. But beyond that, there is the issue of the institutional message. Now, if you talk about in medieval times in the Jewish communities, what was the message? The message was that, we've been through this before. Essentially, this is a repetition of something. We were exiled in Egypt. We returned. We were exiled in Babylonia. We returned. This is another exile. We have a future. We have the same future we had before. We will return ultimately. And the rabbis, for various reasons, and non-rabbinic leaders of the community, for various reasons, had maintained gravitas within the community, strength within the community, and they were able to bolster the capacity to avoid the adoption of the psychologically corrosive. The psychological corrosion of the surrounding society's message. The Palestinians hear, what do they hear? They hear a message from their institutions too. They hear a message that we are ultimately going to win, that we have all this power, we have all these states, that we have the West is decadent, that we have an Islamic message or a secular Arab message, and that the future is ours. And we can and their leaders list things in the mosques and the schools and the media why the future is ours, and that has a certain impact. So people could feel humiliated at a checkpoint or something, but they sense a certain power, a certain future for them. It's a future. In fact, the general message. You look at there's an Arab writer in Tunisia who is referred to the twin fascisms. That's his term. The twin Mohammed Bekri, the twin fascisms of Islamism and Arab nationalism. And the message and how people absorb that message. But it's the message, in a sense, it's very much the message of in Germany between the wars. That is, we are a superior people, meaning the Arabs, and they are the elites of the Islamic world. We are a superior people whose place in the sun has been stolen from us, and we are going to recapture it.
Final question, Justice Bach.
Thank you very much for your interesting talk, and a lot of it is certainly true. But I still ask myself, maybe that's not very attractive, but I feel I just want to express that opinion. What conclusions do we have to draw from this? I mean, after all, if we think and we all believe that finally a peaceful solution will be found, that must be something on the basis of what was decided in Oslo, two viable states, an Israeli state recognized by the Arabs, and a Palestinian state which also will be viable. Now, when Arafat said he was prepared, and he signed that, to recognize the state of Israel, and there were these conditions and in stages, various stages of withdrawal and recognition, and then a cultural and economic development which would be in favor of both. What possible reason could there be for Israel not to try that? I mean, after all, we always knew if it works, all right. If it doesn't work, then Israel is strong enough to defend itself. I still remember when Sadat came to Israel and wanted to carry out a revolution. When Hussein wanted to have a peace agreement and so on. I remember so many people who said, don't be naive, he doesn't mean it. Here someone in Egypt said this and that and the other, it's just a trick to try to influence the Western world and so on, but he doesn't mean it. Now I think everyone agrees that the peace agreement with Egypt and the peace agreement with Jordan was something positive. Now here, the danger certainly exists, but finally, I think we all know that will be in the final stages. I hope it will become sooner, and not later. But finally, the existence, the coming into existence of two states, this border, that border, of course, that's part of negotiation, but that will finally be the peaceful solution. I think that what I'm not quite sure about after listening to the dialogue here is what real and positive and peaceful solution do you think is viable, and what kind of negotiations we are entitled to carry out, and with whom?
Think a moment about what you're saying. Saying, I have a rational solution to this problem, and so we should implement it. But you have to have a partner. You have to have someone else. Israel cannot create peace by itself. If you look at the delusions I'm talking about, there are two sides of the coin. There's a delusional self-indictment, and there's a delusional narcissism, delusional grandiosity. The two go together. Because if you think about the child again, he says, I'm being mistreated because I'm bad, and if I become good. So that's a self-indictment. He's also saying, I can control my father's behavior. I'm in control of it. His behavior is just a response to mine. And what you're saying is, well, if we make rational concessions, of course, then the Arabs will have to follow that. They don't have to follow it. They don't have to give you peace now. They're going to decide when peace comes. Let me go on. You talk about Egypt and Jordan. First of all, you have 100 kilometer, demilitarized zone, policed by the Americans. Secondly, Sadat, before he ever came to Jerusalem, said in front of the Egyptian parliament, I'm prepared to give Israel peace. I want our territory back. I'm tired of bleeding for the rest of the Arab world. I'm prepared to give Israel peace. Arafat never said. What was he talking? I was saying what Arafat was saying in Arabic. He's saying this is the first stage towards the annihilation of Israel. You can't ignore that message. The Jordanians, we had a long history with the Jordanians, with decent cooperation.